Today, we are exploring vulnerability, crying, and emotional depth through the lens of attachment. Hi, I'm Brooke, and welcome to If Your Therapist Knew, where research meets relationship, a podcast exploring the relational foundations of psychotherapy through the lenses of attachment theory, trauma-informed care, person-centered psychology, and contemporary psychotherapy research. I'm exploring the often unspoken aspects of the client experience that shape whether therapy feels safe, connecting, and truly healing. Before we can really understand crying in therapy, we have to understand vulnerability. Because vulnerability in psychotherapy is not simply openness, emotional expression, or sharing feelings, research often describes it as a state of profound emotional contact, a moment where someone allows themselves to become psychologically visible to another person, and that can feel incredibly high stakes. For many clients, therapy activates two competing realities at the exact same time: a deep longing for connection and a deep fear of intimacy. People often come into therapy desperately wanting to feel understood, emotionally safe, and genuinely seen. But many are also carrying nervous systems shaped by rejection, emotional neglect, trauma, criticism, inconsistency, or shame. So vulnerability becomes complicated. Part of the person wants closeness. Another part fears what closeness might cost. This is why vulnerability in therapy can feel simultaneously healing and terrifying. Clients may begin opening up and then suddenly pull away. They may cry and immediately apologize. They may long to be emotionally known, while also feeling exposed, ashamed, or unsafe. And importantly, many of these reactions are not conscious decisions. They are attachment responses. The nervous system is quietly asking, is it safe to let another person this close to me? Research on relational depth suggests that some of the most transformative moments in therapy occur when both people in the room feel emotionally real and deeply present with one another. Not perfect, not emotionally polished, but fully engaged in a genuine human encounter. And often, that level of emotional depth requires tremendous courage from the client, because being emotionally seen is never neutral. For many people, it feels risky. Psychotherapy's understanding of crying has changed dramatically over the last century. In the late 1800s, Freud and Breuer largely understood crying through what we might call a cathartic model. Tears were viewed as emotional discharge, as though painful emotions built up internally, like steam in a pressure valve, and crying released the pressure. The goal of therapy in many ways became helping clients to empty the bucket. And even today, we still hear remnants of this language everywhere. I just needed a good cry, or I finally let it all out. But over time, psychology began shifting toward a more relational understanding of emotion. By the mid-20th century, Carl Rogers and the humanistic movement began emphasizing the therapeutic relationship itself as the central catalyst for healing. Crying was no longer seen only as release, but as evidence that defenses were softening and deeper emotional contact was emerging. Then attachment theory fundamentally changed the conversation again. John Bowlby's work highlighted that crying begins, first and foremost, as a survival behavior. Infants cry to signal caregivers, to create proximity, protection, regulation, and connection. And modern attachment researchers eventually began asking a much deeper question. What if adult crying still functions this way psychologically? Today, many attachment-oriented clinicians understand tears not simply as emotional overflow, but as relational communication, an emotional distress flare, a signal unconsciously sent into relational space asking, will someone emotionally come toward me if I reveal this pain? And this reframes crying entirely, because suddenly, tears are not just about sadness. They become about attachment, safety, fear, exposure, connection, and the hope that vulnerability will be emotionally received rather than dismissed. Current research also emphasizes that crying in therapy is not just shaped by the client, but by the therapist too. The therapist's warmth, emotional steadiness, attachment style, comfort with vulnerability, and ability to emotionally stay present all shape what happens around the tears. In other words, healing often comes less from the crying itself and more from what happens relationally around the crying. One of the most overlooked aspects of crying research is the complexity of crying alone. Because while crying is fundamentally relational from an attachment perspective, adults often cry in solitude for deeply important psychological reasons. Sometimes crying alone genuinely helps regulate emotion. In healthy forms, crying alone may create space for emotional processing, reflection, or grief. But crying in solitude can also emerge from something far more painful. For many people, especially those with histories of trauma, emotional neglect, or invalidation, crying alone feels safer than crying in front of another human being, because somewhere in the nervous system, vulnerability became associated with danger. Some people learned, if I cry or need comfort, I will be ignored. If I become emotional, I will overwhelm people. If I reveal pain, I will become a burden. And eventually, solitude begins feeling emotionally safer than exposure. The person does not necessarily cry alone because they want isolation. They cry alone because privacy feels protective. Research on attachment and trauma tells us that people often suppress emotion around others, hold themselves together socially, and then collapse emotionally only once they are finally alone. The tears emerge not because the pain suddenly appeared, but because the nervous system finally feels hidden enough to let the defenses drop. And this can create a heartbreaking dynamic. The very people who need emotional holding most deeply often feel least able to risk being emotionally witnessed. There is also something important here about the experience many people describe after crying alone. Sometimes they do feel calmer, but many people report feeling emotionally raw, exhausted, ashamed, dysregulated, or strangely empty afterward. Why? Because attachment research suggests that crying is not only about expression, it is often about response. If vulnerability is expressed into complete emotional isolation, if the distress flare goes unanswered, the nervous system may actually experience heightened distress rather than soothing. The body is still asking, is anyone coming? Am I emotionally alone in this? Does anyone know I'm hurting? And this becomes especially important in therapy because many clients enter therapy having never experienced their vulnerability being emotionally held in a safe, attuned relationship. Not managed, not minimized, not quickly fixed, but emotionally held, sometimes for the very first time. And that experience can be profoundly reorganizing. The final piece of context here is emotional depth. This phrase gets used often in therapy spaces, but many people struggle to define what it actually means. Emotional depth is not simply crying more intensely or expressing bigger feelings. It refers to the degree of emotional contact and meaningful experiencing occurring within the therapeutic process. It is the difference between talking about emotions and genuinely encountering them. Sometimes emotional depth emerges through tears, sometimes through grief, silence, fear, longing, shame, or finally acknowledging an unmet emotional need. Sometimes it appears in the quiet realization, I was more alone than I realized. I have spent my life hiding parts of myself. Researchers also describe something called relational depth, a state where both people in the room feel deeply emotionally engaged and fully present with one another. Moments where clients no longer feel hidden. Moments where therapists are emotionally attuned enough to remain genuinely human within the interaction. And importantly, emotional depth cannot be forced. The nervous system only descends into deeper emotional experience when enough safety, trust, and attunement exists to support it. This is why some of the most transformative moments in therapy are often surprisingly quiet. Not dramatic breakthroughs, but moments where someone realizes, I am emotionally exposed right now, and I am still safe. Because underneath many experiences of emotional depth is a profoundly human attachment question. What happens if another person truly sees me? If you walk into a therapist's office, sit down on the couch, and immediately burst into tears, most people would assume something important is happening, maybe even something healing. We tend to think of crying as emotional release, and for decades, even psychology largely framed tears this way, as a kind of emotional pressure valve. The old idea was simple. Emotional pain builds up internally and crying empties the system. But modern attachment research and emotionally focused approaches have complicated that picture in a profound way. Because crying is relational communication, and that changes everything. One of the most compelling ideas emerging from attachment-oriented psychotherapy is that tears are often less about releasing emotion and more about testing safety. In other words, crying is not simply an internal event, it is an interpersonal event. When someone cries in therapy, something much deeper is often happening beneath the surface. The nervous system is asking, will someone come toward me if I show this? Will I be protected or abandoned? Will this vulnerability be met with care or discomfort? This reframes crying entirely. Instead of viewing tears as emotional release, attachment theorists like Judith Nelson conceptualize crying as an attachment behavior, a distress signal designed to establish proximity, care, responsiveness, and emotional holding. In infancy, crying literally functions as survival communication. Before language exists, tears summon protection. And although adults become far more sophisticated externally, emotionally, many of these attachment systems remain remarkably intact, which means that in therapy, tears are often not random. They emerge precisely at the intersection of attachment need, emotional exposure, safety, and fear. And that intersection is incredibly vulnerable. Because the moment someone cries in front of another person, there is suddenly risk. Not just emotional risk, attachment risk. The risk of being unseen. The risk of feeling too much. The risk of discovering that vulnerability will not be received. And this may explain why crying does not always feel relieving. Many people have had the experience of crying in front of someone and walking away feeling worse, more exposed, ashamed, tense, or emotionally dysregulated, because tears themselves do not necessarily regulate the nervous system. The response to the tears does. If vulnerability is met with attunement, emotional holding, and safety, the nervous system can settle. But if vulnerability is met with distance, awkwardness, intellectualization, minimization, or subtle discomfort, the attachment system often becomes even more activated. The distress flare was sent into the darkness, and nobody emotionally answered. And this is part of what makes therapy so psychologically powerful. The therapy room becomes more than a place to talk about feelings. It becomes a relational laboratory, a place where the nervous system unconsciously tests. Can I reveal myself here? Can I fall apart here? Can someone stay with me emotionally without leaving, fixing, or becoming overwhelmed? Because for many people, especially those with histories of emotional neglect, trauma, or insecure attachment, vulnerability has never felt safe. It has felt dangerous. And so therapy becomes not just about insight, but about relearning what emotional intimacy feels like. And perhaps one of the clearest windows into that process is crying. One of the most clinically fascinating distinctions in attachment-based research is the idea that not all crying is the same. Judith Nelson and later researchers outlined several distinct crying styles that emerge within therapy. There's protest crying, which is often emotional, frustrated, urgent, angry, or desperate for relational response. There's despair crying, the quieter, heavier tears associated with grief, surrender, and the painful acknowledgement of loss. And then there is inhibited crying. Inhibited crying may be one of the most misunderstood forms of emotional pain in psychotherapy, because externally, almost nothing is happening. The client may pause, their eyes may water, their voice may shake. They may suddenly joke, intellectualize, look away, apologize, swallow hard, or quickly change the subject. And unless the therapist is paying close attention, the entire moment can pass unnoticed. But internally, the nervous system may be in complete conflict. Part of the person desperately wants to be emotionally seen. Another part is terrified of what being seen might cost. This is why inhibited crying often emerges right at the intersection of attachment longing and attachment fear. The person wants connection, but their body simultaneously expects punishment, shame, rejection, or emotional abandonment. It's the emotional equivalent of reaching for a hug while bracing for impact. And for many clients, this conflict did not begin in adulthood. It began in childhood. In emotionally neglectful environments, tears may have been ignored, punished, minimized, rushed, or treated as weakness. Some people learn that emotions overwhelm their caregivers. Others learn that vulnerability led to criticism. Others learn that emotional needs simply disappeared into emptiness. So the nervous system adapted. The child learned, don't need too much, don't cry, don't expose what hurts. And eventually inhibition becomes automatic. Not because the person does not feel deeply, but because vulnerability itself feels neurologically unsafe. This is especially important clinically because inhibited crying is often mistaken for emotional resistance, detachment, or lack of insight. But in many cases, inhibited crying is not absence of emotion. It is overprotection of emotion. The client is not disconnected from pain. They are protecting themselves from what might happen if the pain becomes visible. And this is where therapists sometimes unintentionally misattune, because therapists, understandably, often feel pressure to help clients open up. But emotional depth cannot be forced. A nervous system will not descend into vulnerability until it senses enough relational safety to survive. And this is why emotional depth in therapy is not created through interrogation. It is created through attunement, through emotional steadiness, through the therapist communicating verbally and non-verbally. I'm not overwhelmed by your emotion. I'm here and emotionally available. You are not responsible for managing my comfort. I'm not walking away from your vulnerability. Because many clients carry enormous shame around emotional expression. Others fear they will become emotionally uncontrollable. But attachment-oriented therapy reframes this entirely. Tears are not weakness. They are often evidence that the nervous system is approaching something profoundly important, something previously defended, something deeply human. And sometimes the therapist's role is not to push the tears forward. It is simply to sit near the edge of them without forcing retreat. One of the more humbling findings in psychotherapy research is that client crying is shaped not only by the client's attachment system, but also by the therapist's. Therapists are not neutral nervous systems. They are human beings sitting in relational space. And when a client begins crying, the therapist's own attachment patterns, discomforts, fears, and relational histories become activated too. Research suggests that therapist factors may account for a surprisingly large amount of variability in how crying unfolds within therapy, which means that what happens after tears emerge is often deeply relational. For example, therapists with more avoidant attachment tendencies may subtly distance themselves when emotion intensifies, not intentionally, often unconsciously. They may lean back physically, become more analytical, shift into problem solving, intellectualize, or redirect the conversation away from emotional depth. And clients feel this, sometimes instantly. Attachment systems are extraordinarily sensitive to emotional availability. So when a therapist subtly withdraws from vulnerability, the client's nervous system often interprets it as, my emotions are too much, I'm alone in this, or even I should stop. Interestingly, research found that clients of avoidant therapists may initially cry more intensely, almost as though the attachment system is escalating its distress signal in an attempt to finally receive emotional responsiveness. But over time, if the emotional wall remains, the crying often decreases, not necessarily because healing occurred, but because the nervous system learned that vulnerability will not be met. And that is heartbreaking. On the other side, therapists with more anxious attachment tendencies may struggle differently. Rather than distancing, they may become overactivated by client pain. They may rush to soothe or fix, or rush to remove discomfort. And this is where even something as simple as handing a tissue can become psychologically complex. Of course, tissues themselves are not inherently problematic, but timing matters. If tissues are offered immediately, especially in moments of deep emotional processing, the unconscious message can sometimes become, please stop crying. Your tears are making me uncomfortable. Let's contain this quickly. And clients feel that too. The therapist's nervous system is communicating constantly through posture, pacing, facial expression, emotional tolerance. This is why emotionally focused and attachment-oriented therapies place such emphasis on emotional holding. Emotional holding is not passive. It is an active relational stance. It communicates. I can emotionally stay with you without abandoning you, overwhelming you, fixing you, or collapsing myself. And for many clients, this is profoundly corrective, especially clients whose emotions were historically ignored, mocked, feared, or managed by others. Because what heals attachment trauma is often not perfect interpretation. It is emotionally surviving vulnerability in the presence of another person. And therapists do not need to be perfect for this to happen. In fact, another powerful finding in attachment and trauma research is that rupture itself is not what destroys therapy. Lack of repair does. Therapists will misunderstand. They will occasionally miss cues. They will sometimes become defensive, distracted, too intellectual, too reassuring, or emotionally absent. The question is not whether rupture happens. The question is whether the therapist can acknowledge it and emotionally rejoin the client afterward. Because repair teaches the nervous system something extraordinary. Relationships can bend without breaking. Conflict does not automatically equal abandonment. Vulnerability does not always end in disconnection, and this may be one of the deepest forms of therapeutic healing. Not the absence of rupture, but the experience of being emotionally found again after disconnection. One of the most emotionally complex realities in psychotherapy is that many clients do not simply fear rejection or abandonment. They fear intimacy itself. This becomes especially visible in individuals with complex trauma, emotional neglect, disorganized attachment, or histories where closeness became associated with danger. For these individuals, the therapy relationship often becomes psychologically loaded very quickly, not because the therapist has necessarily done anything wrong, but because attachment systems begin activating beneath conscious awareness. The client begins wondering, can I trust this person? Will they hurt me? Will I be rejected? Will they become controlling? Will I become dependent? The person desperately wants closeness and fears it at the same time. Some clinicians describe this as the vulnerable cycle. Attachment trauma magnifies relational shifts, especially when the nervous system has learned that safety is unstable. In these moments, therapy can begin feeling like a potential threat, and this is where emotional intensity often escalates. Clients may withdraw after feeling close. They may cry and then immediately apologize because intimacy activates old attachment wounds. And perhaps one of the most important clinical shifts here is understanding that these reactions are not evidence that therapy is failing. Often, they are evidence that attachment is activating. Something important is happening. The nervous system is reenacting old relational expectations inside a new relationship. And this creates a profound therapeutic opportunity because healing often does not occur through insight alone. It occurs through new emotional experiences. Through the client discovering, I can express my feelings without losing the relationship. I can cry without being shamed. I can feel hurt and still remain connected. This is why rupture and repair are so central in trauma-informed therapy. Research consistently suggests that successful repair after relational rupture may actually be more healing than relationships where rupture never occurs, because repair fundamentally rewrites attachment expectations. The client experiences, you hurt my feelings and you stayed. You misunderstood me and then you tried to understand. You made a mistake, but the relationship survived it. For individuals whose emotional worlds were shaped by rejection, unpredictability, emotional neglect, or fear, this can be profoundly reorganizing. Real intimacy carries uncertainty. Real vulnerability always carries risk. And yet healing often begins precisely where someone discovers that vulnerability no longer has to be faced alone. Perhaps one of the most moving concepts in attachment-oriented psychotherapy is the idea of emotional holding. Emotional holding is not rescuing. It is not oversoothing. It is not quickly reassuring someone out of their pain. It is the therapist's capacity to remain emotionally present while another person touches something deeply vulnerable, to emotionally stay, to not flee the grief, to not rush past the tears, to not immediately convert pain into interpretation, advice, positivity, or problem solving. And this matters because many people have never had someone stay with them emotionally inside pain, especially individuals with history of emotional neglect. For some clients, sadness was ignored, fear was minimized, needs were treated as burdens, anger was punished, and vulnerability was mocked. So when emotional pain finally surfaces in therapy, something incredibly important may be happening. The nervous system is risking exposure, and emotional exposure requires witnessing. The therapist does not immediately analyze. They do not move away from the emotion. They do not shut it down. Instead, they emotionally join the vulnerable space. They help the client remain connected to the pain while simultaneously helping them access something equally important: emotions like self-compassion or protective anger. And this is a critical distinction in emotionally focused work. Healing does not occur merely by revisiting pain. Pain transforms when new emotional experiences emerge alongside it. Compassion begins undoing shame. Protective anger begins undoing helplessness. The emotional connection with the therapist begins undoing isolation. And over time, the nervous system slowly learns that vulnerability no longer automatically equals danger. This is what is now described as a corrective relational experience, because what heals is not simply emotional catharsis, it is the relationship. The experience of another person emotionally remaining present while vulnerability unfolds. And importantly, this does not require the therapist to be emotionally perfect. Therapists are human. They may become moved. They may feel emotional themselves. They may occasionally stumble. But in many ways, genuine attunement matters far more than polished neutrality. Clients are often exquisitely sensitive to authenticity, to whether someone is truly emotionally present, to whether their suffering is being witnessed rather than managed. And perhaps this is one of the most profound realities about therapy. People often enter treatment believing they need help managing their emotion. But underneath that, many are searching for something even deeper, a relationship where they no longer have to emotionally disappear in order to remain connected. When we view crying through an attachment lens rather than simply a cathartic lens, something important changes. Tears stop looking like emotional excess, and they begin looking more like relational communication, a signal, a deeply human attempt to determine whether vulnerability will be met with safety. And this reaches far beyond psychotherapy, because these attachment dynamics do not stop at the therapy office door. They show up in marriages, parent-child relationships, friendships, and families. When someone cries, many of us instinctively move into fixing. We problem solve. We say things like, "Don't cry, it's okay, you're fine." And often these responses come from kindness, but sometimes they also come from our own discomfort with vulnerability, because another person's tears can activate helplessness in us, or fear, or urgency, or unresolved grief. And this may be one of the deeper invitations within attachment-oriented psychotherapy. To become more emotionally capable of staying near vulnerability, including our own, not every tear needs immediate interpretation. Not every painful feeling needs immediate resolution. Sometimes what regulates the nervous system most profoundly is simply emotional presence. The experience of, I'm hurting and I'm not alone in it. And perhaps this is why emotional depth feels simultaneously so healing and so terrifying, because emotional depth requires exposure, and emotional exposure always carries the possibility of rejection, but it also carries the possibility of connection, of being emotionally found. For therapists, this means learning how to recognize tears not merely as symptoms, but as attachment communication. It means paying attention not only to whether clients cry, but to what happens relationally around the crying. Does the client become ashamed afterward? Do they apologize? Do they pull away? Do they feel emotionally held? Does the room suddenly feel tense? Does the therapist become overly clinical or emotionally distant? Because often the most important therapeutic material is not the tears themselves. It is the relational dance surrounding them. And perhaps that is the deeper takeaway from all of this. Crying is rarely just about sadness. It's often about attachment, about grief, and about fear, about whether someone can remain emotionally present in the face of vulnerability. And maybe this is what so many people are truly searching for, not only in therapy, but in relationships generally. Not perfection, not flawless attunement, but someone willing to stay emotionally near enough to say, I see your distress and I'm here. You don't have to hide it from me, and you don't have to carry it alone. If your therapist knew anything about crying, vulnerability, and emotional depth, perhaps it would be this: that tears are not simply emotional overflow. They are often the nervous system's deepest question. If I reveal this part of myself, will someone stay? Thank you for joining me for this episode of If Your Therapist Knew. Take care of yourselves this week, and remember, even when an emotion feels impossible to carry alone, healing often begins when it is finally held safely in relationship.